before we jump into our topic, our main topic about being loved for who you really are, which I think is like a core, deep desire for human beings out there. And I know this is going to be a great conversation. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, how you kind of found your way into this work, and just kind of give us a little bit of a kind of a personal side of you, if you will, before we jump into the more deep conversation.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I've always been fascinated by people and psychology and how to lead a good life. I was actually just in the gym the other day and they had a copy of Life's Little Instruction Book. And I remember picking that up as a 16-year-old and being completely engrossed. So, how to be our best selves, how to contribute our gifts into the world. These have sort of always been my questions. And when I was graduating university, I kind of wanted to be a coach. There were very few of them in the UK, and most people thought I was crazy. And so I ended up setting up an organization, Future Foundations, that still runs in the UK, works with thousands of youth a year, to run personal development programs for teenagers. Basically, the education that I kind of wished I'd got, even though I had a very privileged sort of classic British education. I thought that some of the really important questions of who are you really, what do you want from life, how do you lead a good life, that they were mostly missed in conventional education. So I sort of took it upon myself with my then business partner to try and fill that gap. And I did that for most of my 20s. And then I went through a kind of big transition in my late 20s. Kind of my whole life sort of dissolved around me. And what emerged from that was this sort of even deeper sense of, okay, what does it really mean to be yourself? And what are some of the tools that help people do that? What are the problems and obstacles? And people started to want my help on it. So I started coaching them. So I've been coaching full time for over 6 years now. But really for 15 years, I've been in the human development space. That's been the major thread of my career, is how can humans be better, wiser, more loving, and more loved for who they are. So
yeah. Well, who doesn't want that?
Right.
All right. I mean, I really think that your title, Being Loved for Who You Really Are, is really, like I said, one of our deepest human desires. And I think it's so important because I think so often we're trying to morph ourselves into being who we think society wants us to be, or who we think a potential partner wants us to be.
Yep.
And yet, at the end of the day, first of all, that facade's going to fall away at some point. And also, and we are going to be seen for who we really are. And also, that's what we desire, is for someone to be able to really see us for who we are and love us for that, accept us for that, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there are just a bunch of things, mostly from our past and our perhaps early relationships, that get in the way of that. So we maybe lose contact with it, or there are ways that we have taken ourselves to be someone that at a deeper level we're actually not. And so part of it is learning to relax our own programming and defenses and wounds, and kind of be on a journey to recognize our wholeness and our enoughness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you would think that going through life, we would discover some of that and more of that and go deeper with that. And in some cases we do. But in some cases, it seems like that gets buried even more deeply as we go through life. Like there's a lot of middle-aged adults and beyond who are kind of saying, is this all there is to life? Or who am I? Or who would I have been if I could have been anyone I wanted to be way back then? Or what is it that I really want?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's almost like, it can be almost like a crisis or part of a midlife crisis or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, people even talk about quarter life crises now. I think maybe some of those questions that people traditionally asked once they'd build a foundation, build a career, maybe had a family, maybe that family was starting to fly the nest, and then they kind of get into these questions. I think those questions are more available to people perhaps earlier, and the number of different life scripts that people are living, it's just larger now, so there's both a gift in that, but there's also a kind of a challenge of knowing who you are, and also knowing who you are. I talk about this a lot in the season of life that you're in right now, because you might have had dreams even 5 years ago that now aren't relevant to you because life has opened up something else for you. So, part of being who you really are is very much about presence and really not having a story about who you are based upon anything that's really happened in the past. And that's quite scary. I know when I really first encountered that deeply, it's really scary to let go of an identity that people have known you as, maybe you've been recognized for, maybe as a mom or as a teacher or as a sports player, and to really let that go and enjoy the identity when you step into it, but to not hold that is who you are. And none of us is a role, and that doubles up in relationships. So if you're the good listener, or if you're the ball breaker, or if you're the surrogate mother, or whatever roles you tend to play in relationship, learning to be who you are in relationship is actually learning you're not that role, and that you can be loved for something that's more essential than that, more your essence.
So this is a pretty intriguing idea, Jack. This is a pretty intriguing idea to kind of say, when you say you're not a role.
Yes.
But people do get used to thinking of themselves in certain ways or in certain roles.
Yes.
And sometimes when those things kind of fall away, maybe you lose a job, or, you think of yourself as being in a long-term relationship and that falls apart, a divorce or that kind of thing.
Yep.
These roles can disappear, but that core essence of who you are is still there. But how do we discover more about that core essence, like of who we really are?
Yes.
I just think, I think people sometimes think they know this on a deeper level than they actually do. And then you're also telling us it also can change and it can morph and it can.
Yeah, that's sort of the paradox, right? Is that there's, the way I think about it is that there's a thread of who you are that we could probably trace all the way back to, your childhood, that you're playful, creative, or you love helping people, or you're a star and you show up on stage, or you sing, or you express, or you're super physical and you're adventurous. Like that thread is probably for a lot of us been there all along. But then there's the unfolding of that thread over time, and that there is a uniqueness to each moment. There's a preciousness to each season. And if we have too much story invested in, oh, well, I was this kind of person, or I had this kind of identity, or I am and I have this kind of identity, that's where it starts to get problematic, because you're attached to your identity, and it starts to limit your expression. It starts to create friction where life is maybe calling you to something else. So one way that I like to describe it with people, that I heard it described to me and it made real sense, is, instead of, what do I want from life, it can start to become, well, what does life want from me? What is it that life is calling from me? If you think about Michelangelo working on the statue of David, it's like over time, as it gets chiseled away, more and more gets revealed. So the essence of who you are is kind of always under this process of being revealed by life, by relationships, by the moment, by how you express in your career. And that isn't fixed. And the more you can become okay with not having a fixedness about that identity, the more freedom you have, basically, the more ease you can be happy, you can be sad, you can be joyful. It's not like you're narrowed into a particular range. If you think of it like a piano, you can start to play all the octaves and know yourself, rather than, most people know themselves as, oh, I'm a joyful person, or I'm the sad, melancholic one. And actually, we're all of those things really at different times. So we start to open that script up. The point about roles is that we're going to be fulfilling roles, right? You go to school, you're a student, there's a teacher, you're in a relationship, you're a boyfriend or a husband, or however you define your relationship. But the point is to step into them consciously. So for these 2 hours, I'm going to be husband, and we're cleaning the garage. That's what we're doing. But I'm not sort of subtly letting that define me in a way that means I let go of part of myself. Because that's one of the biggest problems in relationships, is if you're letting go of part of yourself in order to be in the relationship, it's really going to start to erode at the foundation. It's like you're kind of now being small in order to stay in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Kind of this going along to get along kind of idea.
Going along to get along. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Or maybe you've only been loved in a particular role, right? So maybe in your childhood or one of your first relationships, let's say this is a classic one for women, you were super helpful. You were kind of the helper. And so your value as how much you help someone. So if you're cooking for them, or if you're making, romantic plans, or if you're supporting them in their business, or if you're being helpful, you feel good about yourself because you're valuable. But then there's a whole set of things you can't be because you have a script like, oh, I must be helpful. And then sometimes what happens is actually you feel angry, or you feel disappointed, or you feel resigned, but your script is saying, no, I need to be helpful because I want to be valuable. So you then start to get disconnected from yourself because you can't actually admit, no, the experience I'm having right now is I don't want to help anyone. Like I feel depressed right now, or I feel tired and exhausted. So that's where it's about relaxing that identity that you're not only a helper. Yeah, be helpful when it's in your heart to be helpful, but don't only think of yourself in that way, because typically what happens is people build up resentment because they're now trying to fit themselves into this, oh, I must be helpful, I must be helpful. And actually your value doesn't come from anything you do. Your value comes from your essence. It comes from the fact that there is a uniqueness that is you, that is, you know, never going to be recreated in anyone else. There's gifts and specialness and expression and a kind of a particularity that is you, that is beautiful and unique. And that's really enough. And once you start to get that, you stop trying to do things in order to be enough. And that's a huge gift for most people.
Yeah, this is such a huge one. And this is such a big one for a lot of women, because there are a lot of women who feel like they have to be doing certain things in order to be lovable.
Yes.
What they think the man wants. I mean, you know, women that are kind of hypersexualized, maybe as children or young adults, you know, they might think their value is based in their sexuality. Well, that's sure, it's a part of them, but they might feel like they have to give that away or to be loved or to be accepted, right?
Yep, totally. Yeah, the I think the paradox here is that it's like there are different levels of consciousness, right? So at a certain level of consciousness, there probably are some men that value women mostly for their sexuality. That might be true. But that isn't really the level of consciousness that I imagine most of the women that are watching this right now are either in or want to be in.
Right.
There's a level of consciousness where a man can actually love a woman and say, I love you for who you are. You don't need to do anything for me. Of course, I love it if you help me or you support me. And I love you for who you are. That's just enough, period. Full stop, right there. I love you for who you are. So you have to unlearn some of that script that has probably been possibly reinforced in the past. That's where this is tricky, because people will say, well, I have all these experiences where it seemed true that this guy kind of really was into me for my sexuality only. And it has to be like, okay, yeah, that might be true, you know, and there is this different reality that I sense that you might want to be in, where the more you value yourself for your essence, for just the simplicity of the fact that you're a human and you're breathing and you have a heart and you have beauty and uniqueness, the more you just value that, then you can magnetize a guy that is also on that wavelength. You know, it's like there are many wavelengths that guys can be on. You want to magnetize one that really can see you deeply and that you can open up and trust enough to let him see you deeply, because there's a vulnerability in that, right? That normally means there's some dark corridors, some places of shame, some places where maybe we're not too proud of ourselves that we've got to include in allowing us to be seen. What's beautiful is if you let them be seen, you're more likely to heal them. You know, it's very hard to heal things in the dark. So.
Well, I also think that allowing that vulnerability and allowing yourself to really be seen, it makes it safer for the other person to allow themselves to really
absolutely
be seen, right?
Yep, absolutely. It's a reciprocity. It's a two-way street. It's a mutual upward spiral of self-disclosure. You know, it's the more, you know, and, you know, obviously as men, you know, the more that we can set that container of safety and trust and realize that nearly everyone has some difficult experiences in their past that they're bringing, so they have good reasons why they might not be open and trusting. The more we can set that container, the more we can do our part to actually help our women open and be vulnerable and kind of get into the yummy places that you just can't really get on your own. You know, that's why I'm such an advocate of relationship, because I just think there's places you can go that you can't go on your own.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. That's for sure. It can be one of the greatest growth opportunities and learning opportunities of any experience that we can have as human beings, for sure.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. That's been my path, you know.
Yeah. So this whole idea of like being loved for who you really are. What if we are in a place, or someone listening is in that place when they're saying, I don't know if I really know who I really am. I mean, on that deep core level, because maybe they've been so focused in the roles that is like what defines them in their mind, at least for now. What do we do to get more deeply in touch with that?
Well, one of the things you might want to do is spend a little bit more time on your own. You know, there's some relationship, I think, with a certain kind of maturing into ourselves that happens a little easier when we like the company that we keep with ourselves when we're on our own. So this is particularly true if you're quite externally referenced, right? And it's particularly true, I think, for a lot of women, is that you're very oriented to the people in your life, right? The people you love and your relationships. And obviously there's something fantastic about that. And it might be that just taking a little bit more interest in what happens over here starts to allow you to know yourself better, right? Because there's many ways we can talk about how do you know yourself. One way is, well, you know what your experience is. So you know yourself because when you're sad, you actually know you're sad. And when you're happy, you know you're happy. Or if you're contracted in your chest, you know and sense that in real time. And to do that, you have to have more attention, or at least as much attention on yourself as you do on the person or the people that you're with. So I sometimes with my clients, I'll challenge them a sort of a variation of the 80-20 principle. So most people have sort of 80% of their attention over there, maybe 20% or less of their attention over here with themselves. And I invite people just as try it for a week or two. What's it like if you put 80% of the attention on yourself, even when you're with other people? And it will normally bring some things up like, oh, well, maybe they won't like me so much, or I won't be so valuable. And part of it is it starts to relax that programming, because you realize, oh, I'm doing a performance when I'm with people. And I don't actually get just to kind of relax and sort of solidify in who I am, wherever I am in that particular moment. So getting more curious about your own experience and what's really going on, rather than what your head is telling yourself, or what your head is limiting. Oftentimes, said differently, we have to get more in touch with our authentic feelings. Like, what are we authentically actually feeling? Even if that's disappointing to you, because you might discover that you have more, quote, negative emotions than you perhaps realized, because you've just not been in contact with them. So, you have to be gentle with yourself there as you get more in touch with yourself. Sometimes there are the things in the shadows that you've pushed into the shadow for a good reason in the past, because you didn't have the resources, strength, awareness to cope with it. And that stuff starts to come out. It's not all, easy and beautiful. And it's really worth it, because the more that gets included, the more you get to be yourself. When you're angry, you can be angry, and you don't have to have a story that you shouldn't be angry. When you're sad, you can be sad. It's like there's a sort of an okayness with more and more of your experience. So a lot of people find this out, actually, back to one of your points earlier, in transition. Like when something, the job, the relationship, something kind of falls away in their life, suddenly there's this space, and it might be very daunting and fear-provoking, but you actually can start to be in contact with, oh, well, sort of who am I when I don't have those other things that I'm externally referencing? So success starts to become a little bit more inward and less externally kind of oriented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when something falls away, like a role falls away, I'm thinking back to years ago, I was in a corporate position that I really, really liked, and the company was acquired by another company, and suddenly we had a series of layoffs that we didn't see coming, happened right before Christmas. And so all of a sudden, I was single at the time. A big part of my identity was suddenly like gone, because I put a lot of my heart and soul and myself into this job, and then all of a sudden it was gone. And what I found in the space that came after that, first there was the fear and the sadness and the disappointment and all of those kinds of things, but I also found that I suddenly had this time and space that I hadn't had when I was working this job that was taking so much of my time, energy, and focus, to like reconnect with me. So I started, in addition to looking for another job, I started doing just fun things, just for the fun of it. And it occurred to me at that time that it had been a very long time, Jack, since I had actually just done things just for the sheer joy and fun of it. Like I'd go to the movies in the middle of the afternoon for
I love that.
Like, I was like, when was the last time I did that, right?
Yep.
Just, nothing really like crazy wild, but I just kind of reconnected with things that were just fun. I was doing them for no other reason than for the sheer joy and the fun of it. Yes. And that sort of was a way to kind of reconnect with me in a way where I was realizing, okay, I'm not just this role that I was playing, that I had put so much emphasis and importance on, and suddenly the rug was pulled out from under me.
Yeah, I totally get it. I think that's, it's not uncommon. It's sort of like the silver lining of things being taken away from you, is that there's other spaces that new things can emerge into that you haven't maybe been in much contact with, or you haven't allowed yourself, you know?
Mm-hmm.
One other brief thing I want to say, just in case it's useful, when I talk about spending time on your own, one of the challenges that people have with that is that it can sometimes bring up a lot of really difficult emotions, right? Like loneliness and longing and this sort of sense of panic, maybe, you know? So there's a sort of subtlety that you may need to, most of us have attachment needs, right? So we have some desire to be, you know, attached, safe, close to the tribe, bonded. And so you may want to notice if you're feeling kind of isolated or do you need more support. Is it possible both to have friendships or companionships or loverships to fulfill some of those needs, whilst you're also spending a bit more time on your own doing the things that you love? Sometimes if people are just so much in the longing that they'll say to me, Jack, why do you asking me to feel these things? I feel this all the time. I cry 2 hours every night, or I'm in despair, or I just long for my man. And that might be that actually if you make a few requests for support, there's then this kind of other space that isn't just a pit of despair that allows you to get kind of closer to yourself and what you actually feel about life, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a really, really important point that you're talking about. And I think, you know, getting some of those needs met in healthy ways can be really important. It also occurs to me, though, like, for example, when I was telling you this story about how I lost this job that I loved so much, I did feel that loneliness and that longing that you're talking about, because suddenly I felt pretty alone in this situation. I felt like, wow, there's really no safety net for me here. And I had more time to think about it. But what I realized too, Jack, and this is maybe just another little nuance of this, was that all of the emphasis and all of the time and energy that I was putting into this job, this career, was so important to me, had in some ways been something that I feel like I was sort of hiding behind so that I didn't have to face how real those emotions actually were. And suddenly they were there. And it got me really deeply in tune with that in a way that I had maybe suppressed for some period of time.
Yeah. Again, I think that's super common. I imagine a lot of people, you know, watching this can really relate to that. Yeah. It's like if all your attention is tied up with something, you know, a career, looking after people, someone else's problems, there's a whole set of things that you don't really have to contact in yourself, because you're kind of fixated over there. And, you know, that's not all bad. I mean, God, throwing yourself into a career that you love or a company that you believe in, I mean, there's so many positive things about that. So I'm not making any of that wrong. It's just to say there may be these other things that once you're less fixated on a particular role or external focus, you might have to come into contact with. And it might be a little bit hard in the way that you're saying. And I also just want to say, I think it's worth it. It's really worth it. It's like a path it's not for the faint of hearted. It might be difficult to come to terms with some of these emotions. And once you do, it's like, you don't have to be afraid of yourself. You don't have to be afraid of feeling things. It's like, that can be a beautiful part of your life. You know, like when people are really sad and they kind of laugh at the same time, it's like, rather than being afraid of our darker and deeper emotions, we actually embrace them, include them. And the kicker is they tend to stay around for less time. You know, it's sort of like if you welcome them just like a guest coming to your door, they're not held down. Whereas if you suppress and repress, you can keep those things in place for months and years. And that's, you know, that's where we get far away from ourselves and we start to feel disengaged and like we don't know ourselves. And yeah, there's a different path.
Yeah, well, and these emotions, these feelings that maybe we haven't felt for a while because of whatever has been taking up our attention or our energy, can also help us to get back into touch with like who we really are, what really matters to us.
Absolutely.
Because I feel like that did that for me when that opening was created involuntarily. So
yes.
It did help me get back in touch with how deep my desire was to have partnership, to have that relationship, to be loved in this way that we've been talking about. And so there's something kind of really cool about that too, where these things can kind of be a gateway and an opening if we embrace them rather than refuse to acknowledge that those emotions or those feelings or those desires are there.
I think that's exactly right. Yep.
So there's something to be said for kind of like embracing the journey, because I think for most of us, we could say our lives don't go exactly the way we think they're going to, or the way
Yes.
we plan, right?
Yes. And seeing that as a good thing. It's like, again, this is sort of like a levels of consciousness thing, because at a certain level of consciousness, you want your life to look like the blueprint that you have. Whether it's a white picket fence or a certain size of family or your certain size of career or fame or whatever. And then there's this other place where it's like, oh, actually, I don't want to be in control of the script. I want my life to be more like a movie where I don't know the ending. I'm excited to see what life brings me. I'm excited to see who comes into my life, what directions, what impulses, what desires unfold for me. But it's a different orientation. It's a less of a control and plan, and it's more of an allow and reveal. And sometimes we call that surrender. How can you surrender more to life? And in my experience of coaching women, the more women find their surrender, the more fulfilled they are in their relationships, because they can allow the relationship to unfold organically, to be what it's meant to be. They're not trying to make it something that it isn't. They're not trying to take a guy who's really a whirlwind romance and make him into a long-term partner. They're not trying to take a guy who's, fresh out of a divorce and is not really available for partnership, even if he says that he is, and they're not trying to make that into something that it isn't. And they can also really let a guy lead. And, not every woman wants that, but a lot of women really like that when they allow a guy to really take the initiative, encourage him to do that, and that they enjoy the surrender of it. Like, I don't know where we're going tonight. There's going to be a surprise, or I don't know what plans are happening. I'm going to let him make those plans. So there's a sort of parallel in what we're talking here in relationship, where your orientation is more, I want to be in my vulnerability and surrender, rather than I want to be in my make it happen and control. So noticing those places where you might have a tendency to control and grip tightly, and presence your fear, because that's really what control at one level is a kind of fear. Like, I don't trust that life is going to go okay and is going to unfold for me in a good way. So I'm going to kind of clamp down and control it. And that only gets you so far. If you really want to be in touch with your feminine vulnerability, your raw, kind of orgasmic surrender, that's not going to come from that place of controlling the outcome.
Yeah. Well, and the longer I live, the more I believe this whole controlling things is pretty much an illusion anyway.
Right. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's that's why I call it levels of consciousness, because it's paradoxical, but something can be sort of true at a certain level of consciousness, right? Just like we were talking about men who are only interested in the sexuality of a woman, that's sort of true at a certain level of consciousness. You can control things. There's plenty of, people that, successfully build careers and, fortunes on the basis of control. It's just different than being your authentic self. Right. So if I was afraid, I could stop every person coming through my door and push them away. I could probably do that and stop people coming in. It's just not really authentic to the life that I want to lead. So it's until you've really tasted it, it might not make sense to you. So there might just be a little bit of try it for an extended period of time, a few weeks or a month. What is it like to let things happen rather than make them happen? Notice if you're filling up your calendar because you don't like to have free time because that feels scary to you. Notice that, right? You're kind of controlling so that you're busy, so you don't ever have to slow it down and feel. So there are these subtle ways that we control. You may not be an overtly controlling person to other people, like you're telling them what to do and stopping them doing things, but you may structure your life, your calendar, your priorities, the way that you allow certain experiences or not other experiences, right? You might not let yourself go and play a sport or play darts or bowls because you're not good at it and you don't like that feeling. So you kind of, oh no, I never do that. I always direct the attention over here. Notice those things. Notice where you kind of covertly direct the agenda, because that is probably stopping something more true and vulnerable coming through. So it's like not to be afraid of our vulnerability, really to embrace it, and that can be hard. If we're afraid, it's really hard to do that. You don't have to do it all the time, but to notice there's something about this vulnerability, even in the moment, right? Of can you sit with someone and not know exactly where the conversation's going or not know what you're going to do next, and really embrace that and enjoy the unfolding of it, rather than, oh no, I've got to have everything scheduled out and know and plan. And, and it's difficult because oftentimes in your career, that's what your kind of employer wants. But in your
Right.
relationship, it's not really conducive to this sort of surrender and vulnerability that we're pointing to, which is something about relaxing into yourself, not having pretense, not being in a performance, getting to be yourself, getting to have all your vulnerabilities, not wishing it were different. Really just being with yourself, because who you are is not just your brilliance and uniqueness. It's also some vulnerabilities and some quirks and some frailties. We're all a bit screwed up in certain ways, and that's part of your embracing who you are. Is like, yeah, it's okay to be me, and me is sometimes, beautiful, and sometimes it's a bit weird,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Don't they say everybody is somebody's weirdo, right?
Right. Totally. And it's sort of like the more, I get to be me and I fully start to relax and trust that I'm okay and enough in who I am, the more you get to be you. Right? Because otherwise, if I'm running a racket on myself, like I don't let myself be expressive in this way, or I'm always obligated. So anytime a friend calls me, I always step in and help, even though part of me doesn't want to. If I'm running that racket on me, sure thing, I'm going to be covertly running it on you as well. Right? So how come you get to be so free with your time? How come you don't have to drop everything when that friend calls? And that's how resentment comes in. So it's using these little places in relationship to notice, is there something that I'm not allowing myself? If I'm going to use this relationship to wake me up, can I notice that there are things that I don't like and allow you to do, that rather than keeping the focus on you, I can turn it around and notice, oh, do I stop myself in those ways? Otherwise, what tends to happen is this sort of opposites attract that longer term, I actually don't think works really well now. I think it worked quite well in the past. But if you're the reliable one and you're always, thrifty and on top of your finances and you're very diligent in that way, if you're too tight about that, typically life will say, okay, so we'll have you attracted to a guy who's carefree and a surfer dude and who doesn't spend much time thinking about making money. And you'll be more in the masculine and he'll be more in his feminine, and you'll constellate there, and it kind of works in some ways, but it's typically not the more fulfilling polaric masculine feminine polarity relationship that most women want. And I'm talking in gross generalization, obviously, but
Right.
most women don't want to be responsible in that way for like, oh, I'm the one that takes care of all the finances while he's off kind of surfing.
Right.
But you can't be in touch with your own playfulness and your own surrender and your own lack of control, you'll probably just attract it in with your partner, right? So that's where we start using relationships to wake us up. If you start to notice, oh, I tend to attract this type of guy, what's going on? Is there something in yourself that you're not really allowing or you're not really in touch with? And that might be the invitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really true. And I agree with you. That's not the polarity that most women want. Most women want to be in partnership with someone who can kind of meet them and
yes,
who is, they're not going to be, I call it the heavy lifting. The woman's not going to be doing the heavy
absolutely
lifting throughout all the relationship.
Yep.
I think that gets exhausting for most women, even very strong, successful, independent women. I think after a period of time, that loses its allure.
I think that's right. Yeah, it's sort of like, it's not to say that you can't do that, right? That you're not capable of doing that heavy lifting, because obviously a lot of women are, amazing in the amount of stuff that they can lift and all the responsibilities they can bear. It just might not be what you really want, right? It might not be your authentic desire. It's not to say that it's like, let the guy bring the groceries in from the car. It's not to say that you can't do that or that you need a guy to lift you because you're not strong enough. None of that. Just tune in. Is that what you would prefer? Would you like that help? Would you like to be, supported in that way? So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that brings us to another little topic I want to just touch on really quick, and that is once you get in tune with these desires and who you really are and some of these emotions, being willing to express them or to ask for that support or to ask for that help. Because, as I do these man panel events, Jack, there's always themes that show up. And one of the themes that's showing up in this particular event is I have men telling me more than once throughout this series, we want to please you. We don't always automatically know what you want or what you need. It's not necessarily intuitive.
Yes.
So being willing to ask for that, to make those requests for support, even on those things that you can do.
Yes, totally. Well, there's a few things I want to say about that. One is, I think there can be this illusion that, if he really loved me, knew me, connected with me, he would know what I want. Mm-hmm. And I think we can just bust that illusion that humans a lot more subjective than we sometimes take ourselves to be, which is that we over-imagine that we think, feel, and behave similarly to other people. And it's just not true. There's a lot of variance in, if I do a certain behavior and you do the same behavior, we might have very different thoughts and feelings and motivations behind the exact same behavior. So there's no shame in having to ask, like, oh, this is how I would feel supported. It's actually an opportunity for your guy to know you more, right? It's kind of like a vulnerability, like, oh, here's where I feel really helped is actually, if you call my mother once a year and tell her that I'm an amazing woman, that's really important to me. And he might be like, oh, I'd have no idea. I would have thought that would be invasive, right? So you actually start to like open up to one another and kind of really get the ways that you make meaning. My experience of coaching is that most people in this sort of category that we could call requests for support, how easy it is to ask for support and how skillful you are in asking for support. Most of us have work to do, men and women. So again, just permission to learn. If we just accept that, like, I might have something to learn about asking for support, it's much easier than kind of imagining, well, I sort of should know how to do this. I should know how to ask for people for help. Just be where you are. If you're good at it, great. And if you're not, no worries. Just permission to learn. And supporting that is being able to discern the difference between making a request and a demand. Because I'll get this feedback a lot from clients where women will say, well, look, I do ask for help. And every time I do, it blows up. Right? I get into an argument, or no one wants to help me, or it just makes things bad. So that's why I've stopped asking for help. And I invite them to really unpack and notice, are you really making a request for support? Because a genuine request for support, really the other person should be able to say yes or no. And it should be okay either way, So if it doesn't have that quality, that's what you want to practice. Practice asking people things where it's not about whether they say yes to it. It's just about you asking and being okay with whether they say yes or no. Or maybe they can make a counter offer. I can't help you tomorrow, but I could help you on the weekend. If you actually tend to suppress your desires and needs, when they eventually come out, they normally come out with some resentment and anger. So that's what people are responding to. When you eventually say, oh, help me with this, or why don't you help me with this? It's like, it's much harder for people to say yes to that. It's much better if, downstream, upstream, when that first came up, that you would ask for something small, like, hey, I just need to be cuddled right now. Takes 30 seconds, rather than I'm letting this go on for hours, maybe days, maybe weeks. And actually all these things are building up in me. So when eventually I come to ask for help, I am making a demand. And I'm going to tell you all the times I've also helped you and that you haven't helped me. Right? That's not a great way of navigating that. So I'm putting that in case that's relevant as a sort of particular archetype of woman. I think that's particularly relevant for, where the tendency is to suppress needs and then go to, I'm kind of angry and resentful, rather than just learn. Yeah. And you might have a lot of needs. That's the thing. Sometimes we shame that a bit in our culture. I'd much rather be in touch with how many needs you have. It doesn't mean your partner has to meet every one, right? Your friends, yourself, there's plenty of other people, your therapist might be able to meet them, but none of us gets more enlightened or aware by pretending that we don't have needs that are actually showing up for us as needs. So it's sort of, again, an invitation to really know yourself. Some people are super self-sufficient. Some people aren't. Some people need a lot of time and attention from other people. That's okay. That's called being you. If that's what's true, really, for you, that you maybe get emotionally dysregulated more easily than some other people, so you need a little bit more time and attention to help regulate you, that's okay. It's better to be in touch with reality than to fantasize that you're someone that you're not, because it will always come out somewhere else. There's no hiding from yourself, ultimately. So permission to be who you really are in this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to be loved for who you really are, you have to be willing to be who you really are.
Totally, right? Otherwise, I'm loving a kind of an actor or a performance or a mask or an interpretation. It's not really you, so.
Yeah. So we've kind of gone full circle here to arrive at that point. And I really have enjoyed this conversation, Jack. I think it's really thought-provoking and really interesting. And I think that it will create a lot of opportunity for a lot of women listening to kind of explore some of these areas.
Excellent.
And I feel like, the audience who is here, we always attract a really amazing global audience of women to these events. And I feel like they're really committed to having extraordinary lives. Mm-hmm. And so I just really want to compliment our audience for being willing to kind of like look at some of these things and to explore and to experiment and to implement, because there's so many people in the world, as you know, that just go through life completely unconscious of what's driving them or what's motivating them, and have no no deeper understanding beyond what's happening on the surface.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I always say to people, if you're doing the work to become more conscious, you're doing that not just for yourself, you're actually doing that on behalf of all of us, because over time, the world does become more conscious. That's my sense of it, right? Like, people learn that smoking isn't good for them, so fewer people smoke. People learn that maybe they don't have to eat as much meat. They learn that. People become more conscious of their masks and personas and relationships. So if you're doing that work, even if no one in your friendship group or your family gets it, it's like you're doing that for all of us, because that is the path. The path is progress and evolution. So thanks for playing your part.
Jack, I really want to thank you. It's really been so much fun to connect with you, and I really have enjoyed our
Me too.
back and forth and conversation, and thanks for being so generous with your wisdom.
You're so welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the dialogue, and I look forward to doing this again sometime. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies. We'll see you soon for more. Bye-bye for now.